Welcome back to the podcast. I'm pleased to be bringing back on Peter Kuper, who was on recently talking about his book, Wish You Weren't Here, Postcards from the Apocalypse, which came out last year from Fantagraphics, and Insectopolis. Peter, I'm going to go with something back that you mentioned last time. You met Harvey Picar at 11 and Robert Crumb at 13. Briefly tell that story again because I thought it was funny. And did you know them later on in life? And when did you realize who they were as a fan?
Okay, so I met Harvey because I was coming home from get buying comics and I was looking at, I don't know, Spider-Man, and a kid said, "Hey, you like comics? I bet there's a guy over in that building that likes comics. His name's Harvey Picar." And so my general sense was if anybody that has comics, I have a right to know. And this was in 1970, so it wasn't like fandom was everywhere. And so went over and rang this stranger's doorbell, and he let me come up for whatever reason. I was 11, he was 32, and he was a guy that worked in a hospital. He hadn't done anything comics related, but had been friends with, or and still was friends with Robert Crumb. I think he had a copy of Batman, which he gave me, and then he walked me back into his apartment, and then he showed me a drawing by Robert Crumb, an original drawing in full color of a guy peeing into a toilet that was an outtake from what would later be a cover of Crumb's high tone comics. And also, Harvey had the whole room was 78 RPM records. He was a big collector. And some months later, I stumbled upon boxes of 78 RPM records in my parents' home, and they were left there by the previous owner. And we were having a house sale, and my parents said, whatever you can sell them for, you can keep the money." So I was sitting out in our backyard, bored out of my mind with these records, and some guy came and wanted to buy all of them. And I remembered that Harvey was a collector, so I called him up. I smelled collector, and I was like, "I'll be right back." I went inside, called Harvey, and Harvey said, "Oh yeah, don't sell that guy. I know he is." And came over and said, "Yeah, Crumb would be interested in some of these, and I'll bet he'd trade you for artwork for some of these." And I was like, "Really? Well, could I also get an interview with him for the fanzine I was doing with my friend Seth DeBachman?" So Seth and I typed up these questions with spaces for Crumb to respond to. Crumb was, he might have been living in Philadelphia or California. I'm not sure where he was at the time. But so about 6 months later, a package came back where Crumb sent me an original drawing comic strip and answers to these interview questions, which Seth and I published in our zine. We still did not really know who he was. So when we printed 100 copies and that sold out, we were shocked and assumed it was because of the Joe Sinnott interview that we had done with the inker for Fantastic Four of that time. Not that Crumb was this gigantic figure in the scene. So about 6 months after that, Crumb came through town. He came over and had tea with my parents, and very awkward. Uh, and then I traded him. He was traveling around with these two other guys who were in a band called the Cheap Suit Serenaders. And they even did a 78 RPM record of their music. And they traveled around and played. It was R. Crumb and his Cheap Suit Serenaders. And he gathered all these records together and said, "I'll trade you, I'll do the cover of your fanzine for this." And I wasn't sure if I was getting ripped off or not at the time because I still simply did not know who he was. And by the way, funny that you're bringing this up because I'm in the midst of doing a comic strip about this story because it was so totally nutty and I've been telling it for years. And so I was like, you know what? I got to finally actually do this story up. So I'm drawing it right now. It's going to be about a 26-page story in my next Fantagraphics book called Time Bombs. Harvey still hadn't done American Splendor. He started doing that in 1976. And so then, he was just a local guy. He self-published American Splendor. It led to the 11th Legend of Harvey Picar. I'll probably be on a panel talking about Harvey Picar at San Diego Comic-Con this year, as I have been in the past. They made the movie American Splendor about him. It was quite amazing, with Paul Giamatti playing him. That was all very amazing and unexpected. I ran into Crumb periodically over the years. I saw him in France at Angoulême, the big comic convention there. And I was chagrined because I became such a huge fan of him. And it's a much longer story, which you can read about in my comic. But he said, "Oh, I still have," and he named one of the records that we traded for. So I didn't feel completely horrible for being the ballsy little 12-year-old that I was, pushing him to give me more. It was one of the real beauties of being in comics. That is total chance. But I was going to comic conventions, and for the fanzine, since Seth and I, who were friends starting when we were in first grade, and then grew up together, and then started one fanzine or another, and then we both moved to New York, and we started doing a magazine called World War III Illustrated, which we're still doing to this day after 48 years,
That's
and still working.
hold on. Yeah, you've known Seth since first grade. That is such a unique relationship. How's that worked out over the years, and how did it shape and influence you as a creator and what you do in life?
Seth had a huge influence on me. He introduced me to stencils and spray paint. And I ended up doing the system that way. I did a whole graphic novel adaptation of The Jungle for First Comics. It was later republished for Classics Illustrated. I did a book called Sticks and Stones that Random House published. It was all done in stencils and spray paint. I did a million illustrations that way. Seth introduced me to that. He did a comic for World War III and a book called You Don't Have to Fuck People Over to Survive, and beautifully done series of stencil illustrations that just knocked me out. He was always drawing. He was drawing before I was doing comics, and he was really skilled, and I was super jealous of what he was doing. He was also more politically involved than I was, and I learned a lot about politics through my association with him and what we were doing in World War III. It's one of the things that people say is like when you do political anything pretty much, but that you're preaching to the converted. And I'm here to attest that I didn't jump out of the womb converted, and that my political perspective developed through all the different music I listened to and the artists I saw and the books I read. And so it's a kind of thing that you develop. And that when we do these political comics, I think what we're doing, part of it is we're helping to introduce people who maybe aren't so political to the subject matter. I just find comics are so complicated that I don't want to just do another fantasy story about somebody punching somebody else. I'm interested in having the subject matter really lead the stories. And that as a result, what I can spend a year or 5 years on, I really need something that is juicy and I feel like I'm somehow commenting on what's going on, participating in it through the work I'm doing. So that's why I've ended up choosing these meatier topics. But Mad Magazine attests to the fact that you can use humor to sock somebody in the face, and you can make fun of yourself and have it reflect so that people understand that you're making fun of the politicians and the advertisers and all the things that they took the piss on, that was about, using that humor as a way to do that. So I just have explored a lot of different methods for conveying these ideas, and in a lot of different graphic novels. Here, this is the latest issue of World War III, and it's about the Palestinian-Israeli situation. And one of the editors is Palestinian, and Art Spiegelman and Joe Sacco did a piece for it. And there's a lot of variety of what one can do. This is my latest book, Wish We Weren't Here. And those comics are, as we talked about previously, they're 4 panels to tell a story. And each one of them each page is a single story about one thing or another. And I mentioned the system that this is doing comics and stencils and spray paint that's what it looks like. Anyway, quick tour there.
So if I did my research correctly, you took over Spy versus Spy right around 1997. How did that come about, and how did you feel about filling the big shoes of those who came before?
Pointy shoes at that.
Yeah.
I was an avid Mad reader. I grew up on Mad, and I ran to Spy versus Spy any issue like first. It's pre-language, and it was always just, I love the sort of puzzle nature of it, the graphic quality, everything about it. But that put that behind me. So when Mad asked me to try out for Spy, and apparently they asked 7 different people to try out for it. I had just finished working on the system for DC Vertigo, big, long, wordless graphic novel. And I was really feeling like I was doing my own thing. And so the idea of taking over somebody else's strip and doing somebody else's characters was really almost not appealing to me. And I almost just said no. And then they were basically, we'll pay you to just do a tryout. Like, all right, I'll give it a whirl. But I'm going to do it like in the form that I'm working in right now, which is stencils and spray paint. And I figured they'll take one look at it. That'll take care of the problem of me having to decide whether I'm going to do it or not, because I've done it in such an oddball way. And instead, it was exactly the right way to get the job. Like, if I had really desperately wanted it, I would have been mimicking Proteus, which would have not been a good fit. It would have been, I would have been swallowing myself into it. Instead, I got to bring my own stylistic ticks and ideas to it. And I thought I would do it for a year or two. And then around the time I thought it was kind of running out of steam, they went color, and that introduced all sorts of possibilities with rainbows and lots of blood. And I just, it was both entertaining and the rare thing that a freelancer has is a somewhat regular gig. And I found it's like a really good friend and fun to take a step back into my childhood experience with it and then try to update it. And so I never had the point where I really felt like I was taking on something. I wasn't frightened by what I was taking on. But after the fact, it was like, oh yeah, that if it didn't go well, that would have been a real fall on my face. And if I had said no, I would have probably kicked myself for the rest of my career. So I'm really glad and happy that I gave it the thumbs up. And amazingly, even though most people think Mad is now past, it's still around and by subscription primarily, but I'm working on a new piece for it right now, and I do that every 2 months.
Does Mad put out any Kuper Spy versus Spy collections, or are they just not doing collections anymore?
They did a one whole book that was mostly me, a larger format, and then they did 2 digest-sized books that were all my work, and they sold tons of them. And since Mad keeps changing hands and going through all these machinations of Mad got bought by DC, which is Time Warner. They went from New York to LA. Time Warner got bought by AT&T, and that the people who really love Mad, I think there's still a handful of them that involved, but the ones that sort of kept their eye on it and thought that was their focus there are very few of those. So for whatever reason, as much as I have suggested, these books really sell easily. They have been slow to do it, but they keep on doing little blips and burps in that direction. And I suspect there will be at least one more collection of my work, because I have with 30 years of material.
Tons.
And yeah, tons.
So you do a lot of the non-dialogue stuff, and you also make it a lot of times, depending on what you're doing, appeal to both kids and adults. Do you find it hard to do it with no words, or is you just like naturally gifted in that area?
I don't know if it's gifted. It has become a natural way of looking at it, and I found I loved, like, with the system. I decided, when I had the opportunity, when the door opened at DC Vertigo, to be able to do a book for them. They asked me to got any projects, and it was something that had been percolating. I was trying to, like, what can I throw out that people will expect from comics, and throwing out panel borders at times, doing it in stencils and spray paint, which I don't think anybody was foolish enough to do besides me. Having it be wordless was rarely done in the form, although historically it has been done. There were artists like Lynn Ward who did a book called God's Man that was a big influence on Will Eisner, actually. And even earlier than that, a Belgian artist named Frans Masseriel. And I was very well aware of those and loved that form. And my friend Eric Drucker is another one who loves that form and works in that direction and style, as with several of his books. It's just, there's something about removing the word balloon and all the freedom to have the visuals drive it. And I've now worked with that form so much that it really is natural for me. And so I'm thinking in visual terms anyway. And I spent decades as an illustrator where you try and tell a story in one image or maybe two images. And so but a lot of it is thinking about a story, like how much can you convey with that one thing and the way your eye enters the image and the being able to play with having an image morph from one thing to the next is just now my brain works that way. And so when I sit down to do things, will very often the material that's in Wish We Weren't Here, which was a Charlie Hebdo strip that I still do every week, I would read a news article and I would just get a flash of it translating into a 4-panel visual something. And so it's now part of my DNA.
Do you find out, because of the way things work out, do you find like yourself flowing with an overabundance of ideas and having to pick and choose the best things?
I'm super fortunate because I actually been in a constant state of, which doesn't mean I don't get blocked here and there, but that I have so many things that I've been wanting to do, one project or another, like this comic strip about meeting Crumb and Harvey. That's been percolating for years. A lot of the projects that I end up doing are things that were either in a drawer or like nudging my brain for years. And so they're like airplanes at an airport waiting to take off. And I have little notes on things. And then there's also, I pitch cartoons to the New Yorker and for other places. And I also am syndicated through something called Kaggle, politicalcartoons.com. Goes out to a whole lot of publications. And I do two things for them a week. So I'm in a constant state of having to come up with things, a weekly strip for Charlie Hebdo, for example, Kaggle, and then every 2 months there's Spy versus Spy. But then I'm always trying to get a project rolling and thinking in longer terms. It's part of having a career that one does that and naturally, but also just fortunately, I have so many things I want to talk about and current events for sure. But then there's a lot of mundane things I want to do and I talk about. And I also like drawing in my sketchbook. So it's bottomless. I tend to work most days a week. Any given day, I can pitch a cartoon to the New Yorker. They have a daily that appears online. And I don't know, maybe 50 or 100 people are pitching for that spot. I will pitch periodically. Sometimes I'm on a roll and I'm pitching almost every day. And then for the magazine, they want 7 cartoons once a week submitted. 1,500 people submit that. And so they get like 1,500 cartoons and they choose 13. So there's a lot of pitching. I have a mountain of unpublished work, and that's part of the deal as well. Failure sits on your shoulders at all times. I have at least 2 whole graphic novels that I've worked out that then I couldn't find a publisher for, or the moment that I wanted to do it past might come back around. I had a book lined up with Vertigo, in fact, and my editor died, Lou Stathis. He had been my editor on the system, and he was the editor on Animal Man and a bunch of comics in the 90s. And then he up and died suddenly. And with his death, the door closed on my next project, which they even announced at Comic-Con. So those kinds of things happen. And then there's a moment passed for that particular graphic novel.
Why did you choose to go with Fantagraphics for some of your stuff?
I started working with them early on. And I have an agent. And when I was proposing doing Wish We Weren't Here, for example, and actually at the same time, I had a coloring book from Insectopolis come out, and then another coloring book that's the Monarch drawings I did in Ruins, the spread from different publishers. And my agent said, those books are not, you don't want to pitch those to your big publisher, which is Norton, who did Insectopolis. And so you're on your own, see who you want to go to. And I just felt like it was a good fit with Fantagraphics. And I started working with them starting in my first book collection was with them in 86 called New York. And I did a comic called Bleeding Heart with them and one called Wildlife. They published a book collecting my autobiographical comics called Stripped, which then got optioned by HBO. And I spent a year and a half developing an animated show that got right to the edge before they shut down their animation department. That was back in 98. This is the story. Like, I've had a lot of fortune with getting things published and out there, and that anybody that has had that much fortune has about 20 things that haven't worked out. Right now, I'm expanding into doing gallery shows. And by gallery, I mean my next big show is at the American Museum of Natural History. And it's the monarch drawings that I did in this book, Ruins. And Ruins is got it goes back and forth following the monarch butterfly as it makes its way to Mexico, and then goes back and follows this couple. And then you pick it up where the monarch butterfly is going, then back to the couple. And it keeps telling these parallel stories. And the images that I did of monarch butterflies were part of an exhibition I had at the New York Public Library, and then is now going to be one called Monarch's Journey that will open in October at the American Museum of Natural History, and also an exhibition in Oaxaca, Mexico. And it's right now in an exhibition in Seoul, Korea. I'm looking at ways that I can jump off the page, continue to do comics, continue to do the kind of work I want to do, and then look for how it can expand in different venues.
I met you twice at the San Diego convention the last past year that I was there, and you were among the people who were at Artist Row. And why do you do conventions, and do people actually know who Peter Kuper is, or you kind of like segment, oh, there's people who like me for the heavier stuff like you did with Fantagraphic, and then there's the mad stuff, or does it all tie together into the whole Peter Kuper package? How does that work for you?
I get the Peter Kuper package. There's always at San Diego and at big comic conventions like that. I also go to the New York one. There's always the handful of people who love the alternative material. And like me, they usually feel like bursting into tears at a comic convention because you see there's a lot of things that are popular and or just it's overwhelming. These conventions are
Very
just
much,
general.
because I was there
And
twice,
so
and
much of it is about not comics. It's about games and toys and all the merch that goes around that I'm so much less interested in. When I was going to comic conventions starting in 1970, my first convention was a Detroit Triple Fanfare with Jim Stranko and Bernie Wrightson, who was a brand new comic artist there. And there were fan artists like Al Milgrom and Alan Weiss and all these people who ended up in the field. I met Howard Chaykin when I was at one of the early New York conventions, and he was a fan artist who then later hired me to work as his assistant for 3 years in the Upstart Studios, which included Walt Simonson, Val Mayrick, James Sherman, Jim Starlin, and then Frank Miller came in. And Frank Miller was just doing Daredevil at that time. So I've been deeply steeped in comics in those many different ways. But anyway, at the comic conventions that I'm going to these days, the thing about it, like San Diego in particular, is people buy original art, and particularly Spy versus Spy, but also I've done all these illustrations for magazines like Time and Newsweek. And there's just there are people that come there that don't come to other things. And I keep on waiting for it not to work out well between the financials of it, which keeps on being an important aspect of it's another piece of my career is selling original art. And it's why as a teacher, I'm always telling my students that they should not just go digital, because having physical art, which I have for virtually everything I do, at least in some stage of it, is a printout you can sell for only so much, unless you're, say, Alex Ross. But an actual original piece of art can be worth quite a bit. So I get that for the people who are fans of Spy versus Spy, but then there are people who have broader sensibilities on these things, like probably like you. And occasionally some of those people want to spend money. There are also international comic festivals, and people come around. I've twice been to Brazil because of one of the people I met at San Diego Comic-Con or a New York convention. I end up getting invitations to fly all over the world because there's things everywhere. I met my French publisher at one of these conventions, and that brought me to Angoulême, the big festival there, many times, and having a French publisher. So there's a million ways that going to those has dividends for me. But I also despise it because sitting in Artist Alley at a half of a table trying to jam the 100 things that I have onto that table, and it's the promo aspect of being an artist that is least appealing for me personally, and probably for many artists. Just going out there and hawking your wares is there's an aspect to it I wish I never had to do, and then there's an aspect to it which is actually getting to see the other artists that come to the conventions, which is sometimes the only place I see them, and also seeing people who are fans. And me being able to do a quick sketch of Spy versus Spy and having it make somebody's day does feel like a magic trick that I really deeply enjoy.
Peter Kuper, we're going to wrap this up. I appreciate you making the time. Thanks again for coming onto the podcast. I'll find a way to get you on again. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you.